Here is the Bock 5.5, and I'm going to very gently insert this on there. And that squeaking you hear is the top of the nib brushing against the top of the inner cap right there. I'm Joshua Lax, fountain pen user, collector, a bit like Ollivanders, right? And all-around fanatic. In fact, I'm so obsessed, I started a business where I get to work with other people's pens. But now I want to show you everything I love about the world of fountain pens. From the new pens, to the old pens, the nibs, the ink, the paper, and especially the people. This is Uncapped. A few weeks ago, I got a comment in response to one of my videos. I think it was episode 4, which was about the giant nibs, the number 8 nibs, etc. And the person was asking if I could do a video about changing or swapping nibs. And I asked that person, what specifically are you interested in? And they responded that they wanted to know basically about how nib units work and whether they're interchangeable and things of that nature. And I think that's a great topic, and I'm going to cover that in this episode. And I just want to give that commenter credit. They are at David Alexander-Watts 6630. So at David Alexander-Watts 6630. Let me first say thank you. This is a great idea, and I think it's something people will find interesting and helpful. I also think it's at a great time because people are going to be going out, as I said in a previous episode, shopping for pens at pen shows, and this information could perhaps be of some help in that endeavor. So in front of us is a series of standardized nib units. You can see that they come from different makers, they have different shapes, they look different, they have different branding on them by way of imprints or engravings, what have you. Now, the big question we're going to answer today is what is compatible with what? In other words, can you swap a nib with something else? And one of my arguments to all of you today is that essentially the feed plays a tremendous role and is sometimes the deciding factor about whether you're going to be able to swap a nib into a pen or not. And to give you an example of that at play and show you also how knowing what the feed looks like can actually help you identify who made the nib and therefore what you may be able to change or swap with what is to actually look at the feed. So let's take a look now at an example of that with some pens from my collection. Who made all 3 of these nibs and how do you know? So what I would say to you is there is one obvious one, right? Which is the Sailor, which is marked Sailor. It has the Sailor logo. It doesn't actually say Sailor, but if you're familiar with Sailor nibs, you would recognize that logo perhaps and know it's a Sailor nib. By the way, it's a Sailor music nib. And I think this is sunlight on the ocean floor or sunlight on the ocean surface. Anyway, it's a nautical themed edition that they made a year or 2 ago. So let's flip over because this is where it's going to get important, right? And you can see that feed right there. I'll try and bring it a little closer in focus. There you go. So that is the typical, we'll call it the typical Sailor feed, right? Now, what about these other 2 pens here? Now, you could go on looks, but they don't look exactly the same, right? The dimensions look a little different. The detailing looks a little different. Clearly, this has cross-branding. This has branding for Ohasido, which is the company that made the pen. But again, the question is, who made these nibs? And the answer to it actually lies in the feeds, right? If you look at these feeds, all 3 of them are identical. Now, I will tell you, if you look up this cross pen, it's called the Peerless, which is like a nice old-fashioned name, I think, for a fountain pen. You would know that this was also made by Sailor. But say you didn't have access to that, you were just walking around in some place where they sell pens and you saw that and you wanted to figure out, well, what is the story with this nib? Is it really just a cross nib? Well, the answer is no, it's not just a cross nib. It's a Sailor nib, right? And it has the identical feed to this sailor right here, right? Which we can confirm is a sailor. And then you have the Ohasido, which is a Japanese pen company that I think recently went out of business, unfortunately. Made really interesting pens. But they were buying their nibs from Sailor, apparently, because at the very least, this nib unit is from Sailor. So 3 different pens, 3 different brands, 3 different branding on the nibs, but here you have the feed. And so what does that tell us? What's the point of me showing and going through this kind of long, drawn-out activity? Well, the answer is, first of all, if you want to know about nib swapping or you want to figure out if something can be swapped, one of the places to start is the feed. And being able to tell if the feeds are the same or the same size, that will lead you to be able to answer whether something can be swapped out. But let's actually back up and get into the kind of nuts and bolts or the real particulars of modern nib units so you can understand why this makes any sense at all to begin. Our starting place today is just a basic nib unit, and I want to talk about the anatomy of this item, how it fits together, and how it disassembles, because it's going to inform a lot of the rest of our conversation. So, a couple of things before we get into taking apart and putting back together nibs. So first of all, and I've said this in prior videos, so the logo here, the Esterbrook logo, that when I refer to the top of the nib is what I'm referring to. It's the side with this logo on it. The underside or the bottom of the nib is what would be facing down if you're looking at that logo, and that is the part that has the feed and the underside of the nib that you can see peeking out beyond that. Another thing just to mention up front, I'm going to talk about certain common things you find, but like any rule, there's going to be an exception. So for example, one of the things I'm going to tell you, and I'll tell you now, is that in modern pens, the most common thing you find is a nib unit. Now, a couple of caveats with that, right? So as we're going to talk about, nib units usually screw in and out. Well, some manufacturers don't want you to do that because they're using proprietary parts, they're using proprietary nibs, and they don't want people to copy it. So you can't always screw things out. Second, the larger point that modern pens use some sort of nib unit that can be screwed in or out is not always exactly true. So, you know, there are a few exceptions. But by and large, the reason I'm starting with this, and I'm going to talk about nib units in particular today, is because many, many modern pens operate on the principle of standardized nib units. Now, when I say standardized, that too needs a little bit of explanation. So there's standardized nib units in the sense that there's a nib manufacturer, whether it's JOWO or one of the other ones we're going to talk about, and they make all these different nibs. They'll sell them to whoever wants to purchase them and use them, and they have standardized features, right? There's also standardization within a particular manufacturer. So some in-house or some companies that make nibs in-house, they will have standardized nib units that are used maybe in different sizes, but the design features carry through across pretty much everything that they're making and selling. And an example, just a very common one, is if you look at the different Asvine pens, that is the pens with the number 6 size nibs and then the number 8 size nibs, what you will see is that they have the same basic design, but they're unique to that brand or somewhat unique to that brand, but they're different sizes. Same thing with Mont Blanc. Mont Blanc, it all tends to work the same. They're just different sizes. I think Pilot and Sailor fall into that, right? So companies that make their own nibs, they'll have standardized ways it works, but it is not all going to be the same size. So you couldn't put a big pen's nib and a small pen's nib and vice versa. I think that's, most folks know that, but I would be remiss if I didn't say that. Anyway, let's get back to the nib unit. So what I want to start with is to tell you all about what is happening with modern nib units, like how they work and why. So we'll start with the JOWO, and this is a JOWO that is branded for Esterbrook, and I'm going to screw it into a pen. What I like to do is just demonstrate for you the method I follow when I disassemble nib units. Now, you may see me in the course of this video depart from that methodology, you may see me in some other video or in person deviate from the methodology I'm going to show you. That's because I have a sense of what I can get away with and what I can't at this point. But this is the safe method that everyone should follow. So for the time being, let's say, do as I say, not as I do, although you'll see how I do in a moment. What you're going to need is some sort of gripper. And you don't have to use some sort of gripper, but I recommend a gripper. I use bike tube. Why do I use bike tube? Well, if you go to a bike shop, they will have discarded bike tubes. When I talk about bike tube, it's literally the inner tube where the air sits when you fill a bike tire or a wheel for a bike. Bike shops change these out as part of the services they offer, and they discard the ones that they don't need anymore. Now, usually the rubber itself has just given up its ability to hold the fills, or it has a hole in it somewhere. Both of those problems don't affect what we would use it for, which is to actually grip pen parts by giving you more purchase, right? So the rubber material gives you more of an ability to hold on to small objects, to get a good grip on things, right? Other people use shelf or cabinet liner, or drawer liners. So it's that meshy material that's sort of rubberized. It has kind of a pattern. It's a little puffy. It's supposed to prevent things from sliding around inside drawers or on cabinet shelves or on shelves, period. Also does the same thing, right? It's rubberized and it's like a rubberized grip. So for this activity, I recommend something to help you grip it because it'll make your life easier. In a pinch, if you don't have either kind of rubbery objects or even like dishwashing gloves, you could use paper towel. That will also give you a little more ability to gain a grip on the nib or whatever pen part you have to deal with. All right, so the basic move when one is trying to remove a nib without unscrewing it or knocking it out, we can get into that another time, is to basically grip the nib above the shoulders. So the shoulders are here and they are here. And you want to put your fingers basically above the shoulders and start to gently rock the nib back and forth, and then start to try and slide it outward from the nib assembly, right? And so now I've gone a little bit lower and I'm gripping it, right? What I'm not doing is putting pressure on the feed. This JOWO feed will hold up very well. However, other feeds that you may encounter may not hold up so well. And it doesn't usually affect the writing so much as it affects the aesthetics of the pen. No one really wants like crushed fins when they look at their pen. Or at least I don't want crushed fins when I look at my pen. So I try to avoid them, right? So you slide this out, right? And there it goes. You can be, it's pretty durable, so just letting it drop is fine. And then you would gently remove the feed. Now I'm just using the gripper to do that. Now, one thing you sometimes see people online will say, oh, I was cleaning it and trying to get the feed out and I couldn't. And it broke. Well, that's because if you look at it, there is like a very thin piece of plastic that is the load-bearing structure in this feed, and you want to avoid putting too much stress on it because then getting it out of here is all the more annoying. For today's discussion, we are going to focus on 3 brands in particular, and we're going to focus on what's called their standardized nib units. So, backing up, there's 3 big Western brands that I'm going to focus on, which is JOWO, which is probably the most prevalent at the moment. Then we have Bock. Then we have a Kaweco nib from Bock. We have Schmidt Nibs, and then we have this interesting outlier over here. We'll talk about that shortly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to disassemble each one of these nib units, and I'm going to show you their constituent parts, and then we're going to talk about how they all fit together or not, because that is one of the questions we're trying to answer today. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you through the individual features of each one of these standardized nib units with an eye to figuring out if you encounter a nib that has some of these features, but the branding on it is not so clear about who the maker is, you'll have the information to decide or try to figure out who made the nib. That will also aid if you ever need to get replacement parts. You'll know exactly what you need and what will work and what won't work. And that was another one of the questions that I'm trying to answer in this video. Here we have all those nib units I pointed to earlier disassembled. Moving from right to left, we have the JOWO Nib. This one is branded for Estabrook. This is the number 6 size and it's gold plated. The number 5 size is not gold plated, it is stainless steel, and it is from Edison. The Bock is this is a Bock branded Bock Nib, so it has the Bock logo on it, and it is a number 6 size nib. This is the Bock number 5.5 size. This is a blank, it has no branding, Bock will sell them without branding. JOWO will be sold without branding, but it will have the details on the top of it. This is the number 5 size. So this is a Bock. It has the Bock logo, so we know it's a Bock, but it is the number 5 size. So there's a slightly larger Bock, and these pieces have an interesting interconnectivity, which we'll talk about. Then this is the Kaweco, and it might actually be a little smaller than the number 5. It may be a spec, though Kaweco orders these from Bock in a certain dimension to certain specs, and it may be smaller than the standardized Bock number 5 nibs. And then we have all the way at the end here a sample of Schmidt nibs. So these two, the number 6 that I'm pointing to and now the number 5, have what I would call the typical Schmidt branding. It's actually, you can see it there written right below that sort of embellishment with the letter B in the middle, which stands for broad. And the same thing is on this nib here that's gold plated. They are both from Schmidt, and they have the typical Schmidt branding. Finally, we have a Twisby, which is also a Schmidt nib. This was one of the early Twisby nibs. So when they first came out, they were using Schmidt nibs, and we'll talk about how you can tell, aside from doing the research to figure that out, that this is a Schmidt nib. And sorry, that's a little out of focus. I promise I'll move this around as we talk about the various nibs that we have here. Okay. Now, what I want to say is a couple things. So I'm showing you the standardized nib units as I know of them. I have seen thousands of nibs in my nib work career, and I can tell you that this is the basic offerings. Now, there are companies out there, and we'll talk about them a little later, that order, Kaweco is one of them, that order nib units in great quantities and are therefore able to have some of these companies make them nibs to spec, meaning it is to their specifications. Okay? The other thing I will say is that not every brand obviously uses nibs from these various companies. The Mont Blancs of the world, Sailor, Aurora, Pilot, they all make their own nibs. But what I would say to you is you're going to see a theme, a consistency here, where no matter what the size is between these different nibs, they share certain design features. It's almost like there's like a system that these companies put into play when they do this design and manufacture of these things, right? And so what you'll have is you'll have differences between the sizes, but you'll also have similarities, and they'll basically work the same way. That is true even of other companies that do their quote-unquote in-house nibs, right? So if you think of Mont Blanc, like the Mont Blanc different sizes, the 6 size, the 9 size, meaning like the 149 size versus the 146 size, the nibs will, and the housings and all the components basically work the same. It's just a difference in size. Same thing is true here. The last thing I will tell you, just because we're talking generalities right now, is Schmidt, which is these 3 nibs, is actually not its own factory in the literal sense. What my understanding is, and you can do further research on this, is that Schmidt buys its components from Bock and JOWO. So when you look at this, you may, if you roll it over, for example, and we're talking about how feeds tell the story, those look very similar, and it may be that these were manufactured by the same people who made this, right? Now, what you'll see is that they don't really fit together in the same way, and that's one of the points, and I'll show you why that is. So that's the basic overview of these nibs. Let's start with the JOWO and just talk about some of the basic features, and some of it will be things you see in both this number 6 size, which is the larger one, and the number 5 size, which is smaller. So JOWO, first of all, let's talk about the nib for a second. That's a little different than these other ones. So JOWO, and it's a little hard to see, but JOWO, when they stamp the nib out, right, they punch it out of the steel, they give it like a downward slant going from sort of the midsection of the nib itself towards the tip, right? And what that means is it's going to fit against the feed in a very particular way, which we'll see how that comes into play shortly. The feed itself, right, is fairly distinctive looking, like it has this nice flat, rounded shape to it. It is less, to me, like a spaceship than the other nibs that look kind of like more segmented and stuff. The feeds look a little more segmented. This is a little sleeker looking. But one of the big things that set this apart from the other nibs is this flat surface that runs the length of most of the feed. And there's a reason why that's important, and that is because of the housing. The housing, hopefully you can see this, right? You can see it has this flat area right there. We'll call it the bottom of the housing. The housing has a space that matches keys to that flat area on the feed. And then going out from that flat area, we have a step that runs from front to back to about here, where there's another step that runs kind of crosswise around half of it. And why that's there is to allow the nib to sit in that area. So as you can see, even without the feed, the housing is able to hold this without dropping it, right? And that is an important feature in the JOWO nib housings, right? So that is the number 6, right? When you are reinstalling the number 6 feed into the JOWO housing, it's really important that you pay attention to where the different spots are that key to the feed and to the nib, because you really want that to come in and out with ease. If you reverse it, it's already sticking, right? So, and you don't want that, and I'm not going to pull it too much because I don't want to damage anything here. The number 5 size is a little bit different. So obviously the dimensions of the nib are smaller than the number 6, but the feed itself looks a bit different. So first of all, at the kind of upper ends of it, you have like this serpentine kind of look to it. I always think it's really cool. And you have a channel that runs similar to this, and it's sort of flat, but it's narrower, obviously, right? So to some degree, there's some miniaturized features compared to the number 6. Both of these, I forgot to mention it with this feed here, have a more tubular tail on it, or at least what I call the tail of the feed. And if you look at the housing, you can see the housing's a little different. The flare out here at the end of it, where you would insert the nib in the feed, looks different than it does on the number 6. Number 6 a little more like, to me, chimney-like. This is a little more like saucer-esque. Real technical terms, I know. So, but one thing to pay attention to is, like its larger mate, the number 5 housing from JOWO is also keyed. So that flat on the bottom of the housing needs to match the flat on the bottom of the feed. And I believe it also has a place to hold the nib. So there we go. So you can see it holds the nib in place. All right, so those are the JOWO nibs. Let's now discuss our samples from the Bock contingent. So here again, number 6, 5.5, 5, and then whatever the Kuwaito is considered, whether it's considered a 5 or something smaller. I don't really know. All of them kind of share some key features in how they're designed, right? So they have like a similarity in the design of the kind of area that sits under the nib and then moving back from the nib. It has, you know, very distinctive look. The thing is, the number 6 looks different than the number 5s, right? And I think I've talked about it in an earlier video. You know, if you look at this feed, that stands out just as much as something like that, right? You can pretty much know right away if you're looking at this feed that this is a Bock feed. No one else is making feeds that look like this. On the other hand, when you roll over the other feeds that we have here, you can see that the part that you would be seeing with your naked eye, you know, the part that's exposed from outside the housing, that part is different on pretty much every one of these. But when you look at the part that's underneath the housing, particularly at the bottom side as I have them here, you can see that they're all very similar. And what's that about? Bock has, unlike JOWO where it's keyed, you know, basically all the way around, Bock has a system where in each one of these housing there's a little, I don't know what to call it, it's a little nubbin, it's a little protrusion that is sticking up from one spot towards the bottom of the housing. And what happens is when you insert any one of these feeds into that housing, that protrusion is going to ride up these channels, and then it's going to come into this little notch and it's going to click into place right there. And that helps, I guess, hold the whole thing together. The one big difference between the number 6 size feeds and the number 5 size, we'll call it the number 5 size because I think all of these are a similar or the same diameter, is that the number 5 size actually has little cutouts for you to place the nib into. So it actually, the feed itself is keyed to the nib. So if you look right there, I'm sliding it away, there's like a little recess or a little cut into the material, or it's molded into the material where you can slide the nib and it will actually rest there. And each one of these has it, but it doesn't exist on the number 6. I don't really know why that is, but it's a design choice they made. The other thing I'll just point out to you, and it goes along with what I'm saying, that each one of these number 5 size feeds is the same diameter, right? When you look at the nibs, right, so the number 5.5 versus the number 5 is actually wider. I mean, you can just see that, right? Like there's a difference in overall width. However, to make this fit this diameter, Bock appears to have made a little cut in, so when the nib is tapering in, it actually is cut in so that it matches the base of these other nibs. And that's kind of an interesting feature in how they make all of this work. The other thing is that because this is larger surface area wise than these two, this is a longer feed, and that helps explain why it looks somewhat different than these other ones. But let me show you just like a little bit about what I mean with the notch, right? So when we put the nib against the feed, right, and I'm going to use this one because it doesn't have a good example of you know, a cutout or an indentation that guides you where to put the nib, right? So what are you looking for when you want to put a feed back on the nib? Well, the way I think about it, right, is there's that distance that goes from about where the breather hole is to the tip. And you want to think about placing the end of the feed between 1/3 and 1/4, so 1/4 to 1/3 from the tip, and 1/4 to 1/3 of that distance, right? And you got to judge it because you don't want the feed peeking out in some way, or it's too far forward, and like depending on the angle you can see that. It's also going to create problems with the flow because these things are designed with some degree of particularity that requires that the parts line up properly. So let me grab the housing for this. Now you see with the housing, try and get the light in there, focus. you see with the housing, there is no flat keying on the bottom, right? However, there is right there and right there a step that's going to hold the nib, much like the JOWOs do. And so that's kind of gives you an indication that that's the side the nib needs to go into. Because again, there's that little nubbin that's going to click into place. So let's see if I push. I don't know if you could hear that just now, but that was it. So right now it's back together. And that little knob thingy is now in that groove and notch holding everything together, right? So let's take that apart for the purposes of our discussion. Let's turn to these for a second, right, and just talk about how we know that they fit together. So let's, for example, take the Coveco and the number 5.5, because there's the biggest disparity, right? You can kind of see that they are, in fact, basically the same feed when you look at them side by side. And in fact, the housings are all the same length and width, right? So let's see what happens when you slide this larger nib onto this much smaller feed, but then try and put it into the housing, right? So again, we're going to look for the keying, and I think I see it right there. So I have it upside down relative to all of you, but I got it. And then you push it in, right? So this fit, right? You can see the feed comes all the way. Let's get that in focus. Sorry. The feed comes all the way to the end of that housing, which is what you want because that's going to help with the flow. But the problem is that there's not enough surface area covered by the Coveco feed. So in essence, what you have going on is a feed that will work, but will stop working because it doesn't feed the actual nib enough, right? So let me grab my thing. This is an example of do what I say, not what I do. I'm just pulling on it. I know I'm going to be able to do it, so that is what made me comfortable doing that. Okay. And then finally we have the Schmidt. And the Schmidt has, like I said before, some similarities to the JOWO nibs that you see over here, or I should say the JOWO feeds. One big difference, and that is the tail. So if you look, I'll bring them in the center. If you look at this, right, you don't have a tube shape. You actually, and let's see if I can get the light to shine on this a little better. There we go. You actually have what is itself like a tapered shape at the base of each one of these feeds, right? The housings are all different. Now, one thing I'll say in terms of identifying nibs, if you look at a Schmidt, you're going to know that it's a Schmidt because it has this metal band. Almost no other nib housing has a metal band like that. It makes no sense to me. If you look at any pen, you take out, or you look at any Schmidt Nib unit that has been used in writing, this is rusted or corroded, and I don't understand why they do it, but they've been doing it for a long time and they keep on doing it. That is an absolute identifiable design feature. On the other hand, these are less unique relative to these other ones, but nonetheless, you can see that like the bases of them are somewhat different than each one of these. Part of it is that taper shape at the base of each one of these has to mate into an opening in the base of the housings that are sort of the reverse of that, right? So it needs to insert and click into place. So that is sort of one of the unique features that you see with the Schmidt, is that kind of interesting tapering shape. Okay. The question, right, or one of the questions is can we swap these things? Are they compatible? And the short answer is no. And I'll explain to you why. But again, the short answer to it, if you want to skip ahead, is that because of all the different things I just discussed, these will not work together. So let me give you a couple quick examples. So let's say I have a JOWO feed and I have a really cool Bock nib. And some people like the Bock nibs as opposed to the JOWO nibs, right? So I decide I'm going to attempt to match them up. So what am I going to do? I'm going to take my JOWO feed and my JOWO housing, because I need the key to match the inside of that housing, and I'm going to put them together, and I say, okay, are we good to go? The answer is we are not good to go. The reason we're not good to go is in part what I was talking to you about earlier, right? As I said, the JOWO nibs have that downward slant that go, from sort of the middle going forward, right? This does not have that shape. And so what you get when you put it on the JOWO feed is space between the underside of the nib and the top of the feed. And what is that problem going to cause? That problem is going to cause the pen to stop writing. So if you fill it, what will happen is this will get saturated in here. You will have ink in there. And you'll have ink that will jump to the slit in the tine, and it will write. But once that gets depleted, this nib will stop feeding, this feed will stop feeding the nib ink, and you will have no more flow. So it's not compatible because it doesn't actually work. It'll work temporarily, but it'll ultimately stop working. So we will take that apart. What about vice versa? What if I want to put a JOWO nib on my Bock feed? I love the Bock feed. I have a pen that takes the Bock housing and it needs to match that, but I love JOWO nibs, or I have the special JOWO nib that I want to use in my pen that takes a Bock nib. All a reasonable question, right? So we look at the keying for the nib, we put it together, we see that the keying fits, but are we good to go? Will this work? And the answer is, again, no. And you'll have a similar situation to what I just described with the Bock, but you'll have something else happening for different reasons. So I'm trying to get the camera to show this. There we go. If you look at the side of the nib, right, you look right in here, the space between the feed and the nib surface itself, right? You can see that there is, sorry, I moved it. You can see that there, peeking through there is a little circle, right? What that circle is actually the breather hole. So what you're looking at right now is the inner space between the feed and the nib, and then through the breather hole, and you're looking actually out, and you're getting the orange from the tray behind it. That is what's happening. Now, is that a problem? Absolutely. Why is that a problem? Well, what that means is that there's a lot of space between this nib and this feed. And what will happen is the same thing that I just described. That would happen with the reverse. That is Bock nib, JOWO housing, and feed. What will happen is you will fill it. You may have some ink saturated in here that will deplete as you write it, and then it will stop working. Or it may be very inconsistent, because if you fling it and it resaturates it, or you advance the converter, it'll saturate it again. But every time it depletes in there, this feed will stop pulling ink from the ink supply. Why is that happening? Well, for this all to work properly, all of this, for any of it, any pen you could think of, any fountain pen you can think of, there has to be a certain degree of proximity between the surfaces on the underside of the nib and the top of the feed. And if you have this type of space, which you can see just by looking through the side of it, you will not have that proximity, and as a consequence, you will not have a good writing experience. So that, again, is not compatible. Same thing is true, I think, with the number 5 nibs. One thing that you just, actually before we get onto that, let me just point out one other thing. The diameter of these different feeds is different. So if you attempt to insert them, this is wobbling around in there way too much, right? If you try and insert the number 5 in here, I think it doesn't even want to go in, right? Which is an interesting difference. So from that perspective, you can't really swap the feeds just because of how they fit into the different housings, even if you kept them together with the nibs, right? Same, so I'll just use the number 5 Bock, for example, and we will try it on the JOWO feed. All right, so first of all, you can see that the doesn't really sit all that comfortably on there, but let's see if we can even get it into the housing. So that's right, but it's now stuck. So the profile of the nib itself won't even go into the JOWO housing. What about this one, which is a little smaller? Nope, that, yeah, a little, no, not really. Okay, so those are not interchangeable. How about JOWO into Bock number 5, right? So that actually, so I've slid it into the grooves on the feed. It's got a little bit of play, but it's not too bad. Let's see what happens when we insert it into the housing. Oh, well, that does not match up, and it doesn't want to go in any further. All right. So again, these are not really interchangeable. When you get over to the Schmidt nibs, things get a little more interesting. So first of all, because of those tails, you can't actually get, even if you could get them into the diameter of the housing, at some point they don't want to go in all the way, and so you would have problems with flow because it's not actually seating in that tail into the housing for the tail in that pen. What's more interesting, I think, is if you actually are able to put, for example, a JOWO nib into the Schmidt housing. So let's see how that goes. So Schmidt, I didn't mention this before. So one of the features of the Schmidt housing is it has this little groove that matches up to this channel on the bottom of the feed. So that's how you know which direction to put it in. But as you can see, the JOWO doesn't really want to go in. So that goes in just fine. Let's see if we try it with the Bock. So that might work better. And if I could pick up the Bock nib, we would get somewhere. Obviously been a long, hot day in the tri-state area. All right. Well, this actually has a place that I tried to put it on, but as you can see, it doesn't at all want to sit. So even before we get this in, I can't even get it to sit on the surface of the nib, right? So what's the takeaway from all of this? The takeaway is if you need to swap nibs, you have to use the right components. And generally speaking, with these standardized nibs, you need all three to match in some capacity. And we'll see shortly that even companies that hire these brands, these manufacturers, or these vendors of nibs, to produce nibs to spec, you can swap them with some of these parts. Now, there's one more nib that I have out here that we have not talked about. And again, this is a spec situation, and it's kind of interesting. So I've kept it for last. So this is a Bexley nib. This is from the days when Howard Levy ran Bexley, which was like a 25, 30 year tenure. He owned the company, and then he sold the brand to, I think, the Armando Simononi or the Penn family, whatever it's called. And they used the brand for a little bit, the logo and everything, but I don't know if they're really doing anything with it anymore. When Howard ran the company, he originally used Schmidt nibs. So if you look at the old Bexleys, you'll see just Schmidt branding on things, that B or the M or the F, depending on what it is. I don't remember if he used number 5 so much, but he definitely used the number 6s. At some point he switched, but what he did was he bought the JOWOs from, he bought the nibs from JOWO, right? So the nib itself is a JOWO nib, and it's actually the dimensions of the old JOWOs. So it has the scroll work on it. So if you see an older JOWO, let me actually pull out an example of that from my trusty nib case. Here we go. So several years ago, JOWO switched from this design for the nib itself to this. And the difference primarily is twofold. One is the nib, the older style had the scroll work on it, whereas this is just this plain line. This has that line kind of border around the main part of the nib. They preserved that, but they eliminated the scroll work. The other thing they did was they changed the profile of the nib. So whereas in previous years, if you got a JOWO, sorry, that came out of focus. If you got a JOWO, it had a narrower profile. In the new iteration of JOWO, this is wider. And so that's like the primary difference. So what you're looking at here, put this on the side there, is, again, if I could pick up the nib, we'll get somewhere. What you're looking at here is the older style JOWO. It's a medium with the Bexley engraved on it. But Howard did something different. He didn't buy the feeds and the housings from Bock. He had Bock make him feeds that and housings that worked with these nibs. So he was getting, I think, a feed and housing to spec because he was buying thousands of units, and he was essentially assembling his own nib unit. So if you are familiar with Bexley, you can try this if you have them and have the nib units for it. I don't think this will actually fit on the JOWO feed and housing the way it should. Actually, that's not too bad. The one thing I think, though, is that because these housings are different diameters, like what goes into a Bexley, I don't believe you can screw this into a Bexley pen. I think you need to have this housing, and I don't think that this, don't remember if this fits or not. Yeah, see, this won't fit in. You need to have this feed. So why am I pointing this out? Well, first of all, with every rule, there's an exception, right? So it's not always one thing. There's going to be differences. And, you know, a little bit trial and error will show you what it is. But my overall point is, okay, so I have this Bexley pen. I want to get a new nib, or I want to swap something out, and I don't know what to do, right? So what do? I screw it out, and I say, oh, look at all this, nothing matches up exactly, right? So what you then have to do is you have to say, pick up the Bock nib and compare it, and you see that it is kind of like a similar diameter, and you can try screwing this into your Bexley and seeing if that works, right? So although you might have a mystery on your hand, the feed doesn't look like anything I have here. It's an older style feed. You still have a way to figure out what you're dealing with and what's compatible and what's not. And so my argument to all of you today about what to take away, or I guess what the takeaway is from today's discussion primarily is that, you know, if you start to kind of acquaint yourself to what the components are and how they should look, you'll be able to figure out what's compatible and what is not. Obviously, all the nibs I'm showing you here have some degree of branding, except for the JOWOs, and JOWO is so prevalent, usually you can figure out just by looking at the manufacturer's information, the pen brand's information, that it's a JOWO. Sometimes these other ones get a little bit mysterious. But the upshot of it is that the components, aside from the nib, will tell you what it is and will also dictate to you what is compatible and what is not, right? So you got to look at diameter, you got to look at the threading, you got to see if things will fit together, right? And if you need to get a replacement feed, for example, you're not going to be able just to pick up, say, a Bock feed to replace a JOWO, or particularly a Schmidt to replace a JOWO, even though they look similar. So I hope that answers some of those questions about what is compatible and what is not. The answer is, with all of these things, there's very little compatibility. That is the basics of the nib units themselves. Now let's turn to some experimentation using some of these in actual pens. 3, 2, 1. Having reviewed the different nib units in depth, let's actually show you a practical application of all that information. And to do that, we're going to have a look at my Visconti Divina Commedia Inferno. Divina Commedia refers to the Divine Comedy, and most of you will know that the Divine Comedy was written in 3 parts by Dante, the first being the Inferno, which is hell. And so this, you could see right there, is the Inferno model, and it has kind of a fiery, sort of swirly, dark cloud, darkness, Prince of Darkness type of motif going on in that plastic. So let's say I love this pen, which I do, and I have a problem with the pen, it falls apart, it rusts, or I would hate this nib, I don't know, I want something different. I love Bock, I love JOWO, there's just something about this nib I don't like, right? Which is not true. I like this nib and I like this pen very much. In any event, let's zero in on that nib, right? So it is a steel nib. What some of you will know is that Visconti, their gold nibs are made in-house, but their steel nibs are purchased from another manufacturer. And so we have here a steel nib. Now, it is not marked or indicative of any particular of the big 3 nib makers, right? All we have in front of us is sort of like this 3-line border, a V, which is presumably for Visconti, and a B for the fact it's a broad nib, and then the word Visconti underneath it, right? So on the surface of the nib, the top of the nib, there is nothing that indicates to us what this is. So if we need to swap this or we want to use this in another pen because we love the nib in particular, you know, the question becomes what is it, right? So we go to our next step, which I've been talking about in this video, is to look at the feed, right? And we can see that this, if you compare it to the other feeds we were just looking at, is very similar, almost the same as a Schmidt nib, but not entirely. I think that the kind of flat edge there doesn't go as deep on the Schmidt nib we were looking at earlier. So what is the next thing you do? So, right, we think we might have a Schmidt nib. One thing you want to do before you unscrew a nib unit, I didn't say this earlier, is actually take the converter out, because that will prohibit you from doing it, and if you yank it, it might damage the converter. So best practice is to remove the converter. So we unscrew the nib from the section, and what we see is what looks to be very much the typical Schmidt housing, right? And to confirm that, right, we will take this Bennu. I think this is a gemstone. I call it the kryptonite. It looks otherworldly or alien-like because of the colors. But they use Schmidt nibs. We know they use Schmidt nibs. And in fact, the nib says Schmidt on it. So it's a Schmidt nib, right? And you can kind of already see through this that there's going to be a similarity. So we unscrew this, and lo and behold, what do we find? The Visconti steel nib and the Bennu nib are identical pretty much in every way, except obviously the nibs look very different. And you wouldn't necessarily draw the connection looking at that Visconti nib with this. It's really taking it out. You see that. Now, let me put this back in for a second. And let's talk about what if you had a situation where you couldn't unscrew this nib from the pen. I actually, for a while, didn't think that that would be possible, but as we saw, it was very easy to do. So let's say I can't unscrew this housing out of the section for whatever reason. This is a pen that doesn't allow it. It's glued. Someone in the past tried to seal it for some ridiculous reason, or they over torqued it. You can't get it out. There's some reason for that, right? So we go to the next step, which is what we were demonstrating before, right? So we take the nib out. Right? And we see the feed and we see the nib, right? We've already compared the housing. Now I want to compare what's here with what's here. And you can already see that they are very much similar, just from the area of the nib that we can see without taking it out. But we remove it, put the nibs side by side, and we see that there's another design feature that's similar on both of these, which is it has this little V cutout in the base of the nib. And actually side by side they look much more similar to me than they did when they were in the pen. But we can see that these two feeds are more or less identical, right? So again, we have now the means to confirm that the Bennu nib and the Visconti nib, at least when we're talking about the Visconti steel nibs, are interchangeable, right? And we've deduced that through a little bit of nib detective work, which is to say that all we really did was take these apart. And in fact, if you were to want to experiment, you could put the Visconti nib, it fits in a little indentation in that feed, into the Bennu, right? So if you like the Visconti way it looked, and actually with this pen might be actually a perfect combination. I don't know if you can actually get Schmidt nibs that have like a ruthenium or a black finish on them. But let's say this is what I wanted to do. I really cared about getting this aesthetic. I didn't want this nib. I'll use it in a different pen. Now you know you can actually put this in a pen together. So that's the practicality of everything I was talking about. I know it was a long explanation to get there, but the purpose was to show you how in the real world of pens, you know, these pieces of information can be obtained through these types of observations and this type of experimentation, and then used to a practical purpose if you need it. So hopefully I've answered a number of questions today. Now, what I want to say is I've covered JOWO, Bock, and Schmidt, which are the major German nib makers. What I'd like to do is do a second video, which will be forthcoming, where I talk about nib units from India and I talk about nib units from China, because those are a separate category, but nonetheless they are interchangeable, with some interesting little factoids I hope to point out. So I hope that this has been valuable and I've answered the question asked in the comment, and I will continue to do so in part 2. And for the rest of you that came on this journey, this has been helpful and informative, and I look forward to talking to you more about nibs real soon. Thank you so much. Goodbye.